We are moments away from Fed Chair Jerome Powell's press conference. Here to talk more about today's decision and what to expect from Powell, we are bringing in former Minneapolis Fed President Gary Stern. Gary, it is great to see you.
Good to be here.
So maybe, Gary, listen, let's just start high level. Your reaction, your response.
Well, from the statement, I don't think there was any surprise in that statement whatsoever, and I'm sure that was the Fed's intention. They're not up to surprises these days for the most part, and I think it's what people in the markets expected. So, it achieved, as far as I'm concerned, it achieved what it intended to.
So much of this is obviously about the expectations game, and certainly you'd imagine the Fed Chair is going to get questions today about why it was messaged in a way where the market sort of set the expectation for a potential rate cut come June. Was the Fed too optimistic, you think, about the speed of deceleration for inflation?
Well, with the benefit of hindsight, certainly. But I think more fundamentally, I think the Fed probably gave itself too much credit for the deceleration that was occurring, in the sense that and they attributed it to restrictive policy, whereas some of that deceleration was continued unwinding of all the disruption and supply side constraints and so forth from COVID and its aftermath. And that had longer tail than I think the Fed expected. That's nothing to get all that worked up about. I mean, COVID is a once in 100-year event, but and so there was no prior experience with something like that. But I think the Fed perhaps was overly optimistic about what policy had achieved as opposed to what was just naturally occurring in the economy.
And what, Gary, gets us, I guess, back to the Fed's target then? And how long before we do get back there?
Well, that's a very tough question. And in fact, that's a question I'd ask Chairman Powell if I had a chance. I think it's going to take some time, because I think there's a lot of inertia in the inflation process. And I think we're seeing some of that now. And so I think it's going to take some time for inflation to return to 2%. I think it will do so because inflation expectations are very well anchored to that 2% or so number. Not just because the Fed has been religious about maintaining it, but most central banks around the world have as well. Their commitment to low inflation seems to be definitive. And as a consequence of that, ultimately that anchor will prevail, but I think it's going to take time.
When you say that there's a lot of inertia,
yes.
What do you mean specifically?
Well, what I mean by that statement is, if you look at the historical behavior of inflation, the best way to forecast inflation a year from now is to ask yourself, what has it been in the previous 12 months? And so if you say it's been, say, 3%, just to pick a round number, if I had to make a forecast for the next 12 months, I'd say 3%. Now, that's not going to be a perfect forecast, but it's a forecast that worked quite well following the financial crisis. It worked quite well prior to the financial crisis. There's a lot of evidence. What I'm trying to get to is there's a lot of evidence in terms of that kind of forecast. Why is there inertia in the inflation process? Well, I think it boils down to the fact that we have a big, complex, sophisticated economy, and with millions of decision makers. And you just don't expect that people's behavior and decision making is going to change on a dime, or change just because the Federal Reserve or some other policy maker says, I think X is going to happen rather than Y.
I mean, let's pick up on that complexity, though, because one of the things we were talking about on set earlier is that the question I keep going back to is how much of this last mile is in the Fed's control. There's certainly a lot of other factors that are at play. You've got a war going on.
That's a very good point.
And so how much of, what does the Fed need to do to maybe guard against some of those risks that are not necessarily in the central bank's control that could accelerate inflation further?
Well, I think there's a two-part answer. The first part is patience. The Fed shouldn't kid itself that just because it'd like to get to 2%, it's going to get there smoothly. And I don't think they do, by the way. And you're quite right that something could come along and disrupt it. On the other hand, something could come along and accelerate achievement of the goal too, although I don't think I can identify anything at the moment. So I think patience is important. And I think beyond that, I mean, the Fed, if I were still at the Fed, I'd be asking myself, have we done enough? Or do we have to do more to make sure we achieve our inflation target? Right now, I would, as I said, be patient, but I don't think you can take off the table the possibility that, despite all the progress that's been made on the inflation front, and there has been significant progress, no doubt, it may require further action.
Gary, we are in an election year. You wouldn't be surprised if at the presser Powell gets asked again about that, and he would probably repeat, listen, we're independent. But they have to be thinking about it, don't they, Gary?
I've thought a lot about that question, and the more I think about it, the more I think that it's actually quite simple. What the Fed has to do is the right thing, whatever it may be. And if you do the right thing and you have a compelling explanation for why it's the right thing, you don't have to worry about the politics. And that's the way to proceed. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who has thought about that. I'm sure plenty of the people in the Federal Reserve have thought about that. And I would be very surprised if they hadn't reached the same conclusion. If you do the right thing, your defense is easy, and you don't have to worry about the politics.
So you don't think the Fed's going to hesitate to move
in
the fall if the data necessitates that?
I do not. I do not. I would be very surprised if that concern arose at all. That doesn't mean the Fed doesn't. I mean, they know it's the election season. It's not that. But if you do the right thing, you don't have to dream up complicated explanations, or we're a little concerned about this and a little more concerned about that. Don't get into that game.
What did you think, Gary? Just stick with this question, just because you have such inside knowledge here. I have to ask you, that journal headline we were talking about earlier, suggesting Trump allies maybe drafting rules to erode the Fed's independence. Give me your take.
Well, two things. First of all, I think it's a bad idea. And I think if it's not broken, don't fix it. I think the Federal Reserve, on average, has served the country well, and you ought to leave it alone. Having said that, the politics of something like that, I don't think they can unilaterally achieve that much.